Hello, this is Anthony O'Sullivan, Director and Partner at Whiteshield Partners, and here with Thomas Flynn, who's a Senior Manager at Whiteshield Partners, an expert on labor policy among a number of different other policy areas. Tom, we're launching today the Global Labor Resilience Index 2021, and there are a number of findings, of course, in particular in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. It seems that the United States and Canada have done relatively well in the index, with the United States ranked 14 and Canada ranked 16. What would be your observations on the labor resilience of these two countries?
Thank you, Anthony. Very happy to obviously, to have the chance to obviously speak with you in terms of the GLRI results, and specifically to look at, North America and at least as to what we've seen over the past year of the GLRI and in terms of the performance, within North America. We know that when we see the North American labor market, and at least for the GLRI, we're talking explicitly about Canada and the United States. And we know that traditionally, both of these labor markets have been very strong in comparison to, the global labor markets themselves. That they've got strong legal protections in general, they've got social welfare systems that are functioning, they're rewarding in terms of skilled labor and in terms of education, and in terms of being able to, graduates into the labor market to find solid jobs. And they also support labor market mobility, basically. So easy to obviously go from state to state in the US or province to province within Canada to find new types of jobs. However, within the last year, we've actually seen that, the responses of the two labor markets to COVID-19 have shown actually very, significant differences between the two labor market systems. Particularly when we look at, the GLRI and its three of the core capabilities in terms of whether a labor market is absorptive, can it absorb, that initial type of shock, maintain employment of different people, provide them, the unemployment protections, et cetera. Two, can the labor market adapt to the particular shock? So can it actually get people who may be out of work or whatever back into jobs? And then can it support actually the transformation? So to actually change the labor market itself, to make it stronger and to make it more resilient within the future. And we see, at least when we compare these two countries, there's the different responses between them. I'll take one look at, each of them at a time. For example, within the United States, we see that the response within the United States and the labor market response to COVID really showed, a very significant dual labor market system within the United States for highly skilled workers compared to unskilled workers. And we see this in terms of the imbalanced capabilities of the response within the United States along these three different facets, which have basically led to some major vulnerabilities that we saw during COVID and actually now into the post-COVID. So we'll take a look at these. We look at the absorption capacity of the United States. So when COVID hit, we saw actually unemployment rising up to about 14%. So that was actually the highest rate of unemployment that it's been since the times of the Great Depression. And we've seen at least that the social protection system within the United States to support the unemployed didn't work at first in many of the different states themselves. And we saw long lines at the unemployment system. You saw unemployment system registrations crashing. People couldn't access different benefits, despite the fact that the federal government as well was, shoveling lots and lots of money into unemployment to support workers. So the structure, at least that basic capability, to maintain people into jobs and then to support people who, had forced to leave their jobs, didn't actually succeed. And this was particularly true for underskilled employees. So you see that the unemployment rates, for example, for the lower skilled, so people without a college degree, for example, reached up to about 17%, versus 8% for people with college degrees. So you already see with the very initial stage, very, very different type of response in terms of how the shock can be absorbed, what the state's response is going to be, and then how different segments of the labor market actually, we're able to cope with the shock itself. On the adaptive front, though, you did see actually that the labor market within the United States, at least when looking at from the unemployment rate, has increased in terms of the adaptive component of it, allowed the United States to recover from a labor market perspective relatively quickly and relatively well, particularly compared to other countries. That the U.S. labor market is generally adaptive, allows multiple different types of contracts. Mobility is relatively good within the United States. Jobs basically are created at a relatively good pace in the United States in comparison to some other countries. But we once again see that a lot of these benefits were for more of the skilled type of workers. So even now, that the unemployment for skilled laborers under 4% in comparison to just 8% for the high school graduates. So you can already see even within the adaptive phase, as people have started to get back into jobs, is that one, you don't have the same recovery, the pre-COVID kind of labor market recovery that you see for the unskilled people, as that you've actually seen for the skilled workers. And the third aspect in terms of this transformation is you do see, of course, within the United States, the labor market transforming. You see more people working remotely, more companies allowing that, increased digitalization, different types of work contracts actually being structured, companies allowing their employees, different types of flexi benefits, et cetera. But once again, a lot of this concentration is, more toward the skilled employees. So one thing that you may see actually from COVID itself is you may see this kind of dual nature of the US labor market kind of continuing to increase. In contrast, a nice little point in terms of Canada, you see that Canada, ranks slightly lower, at least within the GLRI in terms of the ranking, but we saw that it had a bit more balance in terms of its cyclical resilience capabilities. In particular, its absorptive capacity was stronger, than the United States. So Canada traditionally has a stronger welfare system, stronger healthcare system, coverage and support for its workers in terms of active labor market policies, training, retraining, and then getting people back into, the jobs. So you see that at least, Canada's unemployment never reached up to at least the 14%. For example, I think it was around 10% was the high within August. But the adaptive, capability, the ability to recover, from the shock has not been as strong. So even now, Canada's unemployment rate, still remains at about 9%, for example. So you didn't see that initial, kind of shock or as strong of a shock to the labor market itself. Also, the recovery, hasn't been as strong. When we look at the transformative capacities of Canada itself, one thing that we kind of see is still the structural vulnerabilities within Canada's economy, which obviously affects job growth and the types of jobs that are available. So for example, one example is the trade shocks and how Canada still remains vulnerable to trade shocks because of its strong export concentration on crude oil. And what does this mean? It basically means that you've got a number of different jobs, primarily in the crude oil sector, particularly in Alberta, for example, within Canada, and you've got some very well and high-paying jobs for lower skilled type of employees, but obviously those jobs are at the mercy of trade fluxes or commodity fluxes or fluctuations. So in some ways, the COVID crisis basically has shown some of these differences in the dual kind of labor markets within Canada, which may be a bit less flexible, but it may be more supportive of the different workers. In the United States, which offers less in terms of social protection, social mobility, but allows for a greater degree of flexibility and perhaps allows for a quicker recovery from a much deeper crisis impact.
Very good, thank you, Tom. Very insightful. Now, one of the dimensions of the GLRI 2021 is to consider different levels of devolution of power in countries and what can be done at the national level versus what can be effective at the regional, the city level. Would you have any thoughts about whether one level or another might have been more effective in the context of the United States or Canada?
So when we take the United States, and that's another actually fascinating example in terms of the differing response to COVID. So the United States, of course, has a federal system. So the federal government, in and of itself, is able to pass stimulus packages. So, for example, Joe Biden's administration is, kind of the 1.9 trillion stimulus, in one component of course, to support, labor, itself. But two, within the United States, that most of actually labor market policies are done at the state level. So a lot of times, the direct type of unemployment insurance programs, the direct job trainings, all these types of aspects are done at the state level. And you see very different outcomes in states depending on the nature of the government by the particular state, how the state's labor market itself is organized, and then what basically supports are provided to labor. For example, you had some states which basically, have basically underfunded their unemployment insurance for a number of years up to this particular point. I think if you take a look at some of the states, for example, in the South, so when we did the GLRI last year, we looked at, the vulnerabilities across, the US regions. And one of the things that we actually saw was in the South of the United States is that, social protections for workers are generally lower. One of the reasons is that states are generally underfunding, their unemployment insurance funds. So one of the things that you saw during COVID is you actually saw large lines of people standing outside the unemployment insurance offices. I think there's one example, for example, in Alabama, if I'm not mistaken, where you see all these people who are standing in line to actually collect their unemployment insurance, obviously in line with COVID, not in terms of the social, kind of distancing aspect of it. You have other states who basically computer capacity systems were overwhelmed by the number of applications for unemployment insurance. They didn't necessarily have the tech background or tech abilities to actually scale up those systems, bring in different people, to support in terms of collecting the applications themselves. You had other states, though, in some of the more northern type of states, and particularly kind of the Northeast states, which had a bit more robust of a social protection network kind of in place even before COVID. And basically, it's been supportive a little bit more in terms of some of these workers. So even at the U.S. state level, you see kind of varieties or variation in terms of the response, to COVID itself. One of the positive aspects I think you've actually seen within the United States, response to COVID at least itself, and in terms of the structuring of the, kind of the government itself, is that you did see a large, massive, federal government stimulus to support both businesses. So to ensure that, businesses, one could receive loans if they were actually using those loans and the proceeds of those loans to actually maintain employment. So you actually did see a number of different businesses which basically reported that they're able to actually keep people on due to those different federal government loans. And then two is actually saw a huge increase in federal funding for U.S. state employment unemployment insurance programs. So on top of the general state benefits, and the state benefits vary by state, the federal government put a cap of, I think it's 400, 600, for example, additional US dollars on top of per week on top of already, all the already existing, state employment insurance programs. So you actually have a number of different states who are actually able to, one, when people are actually able to sign up, for these particular programs, and we're actually able to ensure that people, one, could actually have sufficient, support in order to continue to, obviously purchase food, buy clothing, do their daily types of tasks, maintain rent, continue to live in their different housing. And then those benefits are actually extended in terms of duration. So actually allowing them for, longer than kind of the traditional short, 8, 12 weeks or what have you in terms of a typical, U.S. unemployment insurance package. So it's a lot to say is that, I think of it in terms of the flexibility, was a kind of a critical, kind of point. Two, I think in terms of the quick response, and then three, I think is the combination of, the explicit policy response from the federal government of, we're going to pass the stimulus package. This will actually support or top up some of the state level programs themselves, but combined with a more monetary policy approach, as in, okay, let's create, kind of the additional monetary funds to actually support, SMEs to make sure that they continue to maintain hiring of people. So I'd say those would be the three, at least, things that we've seen that maybe were a good portion of the response to COVID.
Thank you, Tom. Very clear. Now, if we turn to actions going forward, what would you recommend Canada and the United States do in the next year and maybe even longer term in order to boost their labor market resilience and perhaps enter the top 10 ranking?
So at least we saw within the United States is that the current capabilities are very imbalanced, so that, one, you've got the adaptive capability, so this ability to actually provide, the social welfare system or those types of supports, obviously needs, certain support within the federal government. You see once again that at least in the near term, that the administration of Joe Biden, in terms of this 1.9 trillion, stimulus, is basically going to support and continue to extend the unemployment insurance, benefits for the U.S. So that's one, kind of very short-term, policy that can continue to support the labor market within the U.S. The second one could be to maintain the openness of the United States labor market, but also its educational system, to both foreign students and to foreign workers. So we saw within the Trump administration that a lot of it has been, how do we close, for example, the labor market, the U.S. jobs first, U.S. employees first, and that obviously had an effect in terms of both, talented workers who would come into the United States in terms of visa applications and actually, the acceptance of certain visa applications, but then as well, foreign students who then, obviously foreign students graduate from U.S. universities and continue to stay on and to work, within the United States as another pool of, talented and skilled labor, to support obviously the U.S. labor market, the U.S. economy, et cetera. So I think those are the two, at least kind of core, kind of initial pieces, for the United States. When we look at, kind of the longer term pieces, at least within the U.S., we look at some of the structural issues that basically hurt the United States labor market. So income inequality, so this dual type of labor system, how to actually ensure that jobs for more the blue collar type of workers are still there, how to ensure that there's the adequate retraining facilities, the actual ways to support or encourage different sector mobility, how to ensure that there are different supports provided, whether it be in terms of healthcare coverage, so that people don't have to have their healthcare explicitly tied to their job status, and basically to support kind of the broader welfare system. So as we transition to a continued more digital and kind of dynamic, let's call it work and labor force, that people have the support to transition jobs, can be retrained and can kind of move dynamically. Within the Canada, example, some of these kind of structural points kind of can be touched on again. So we already talked in terms of the export concentration, for Canada itself. So one of the big, kind of pushes, would be in terms of, developing, the green economy and supports for the green economy, to develop, alternative jobs, for example, than from the export and commodity export sector. To healthcare coverage itself. So I know that at least within Canada, the movement has been, towards higher healthcare costs with not necessarily great healthcare outcomes. So a system that at least I've seen within the United States, it's not good for workers, not good for budgets, not good for anything. And to be able to move, I think, in those two different, those directions, I think are important as well.
Thank you, Tom Flynn, for these insights on the Global Labor Resilience Index 2021, in particular on the United States and Canada. And let's hope that many of these actions that you suggested will be implemented to improve their ranking in the labor market resilience.
Thank you.